Welcome to Back to the Texts Themselves, a series on phenomenology. Today's video examines sections 45 to 47 of Heidegger's Being and Time. I think about death often, not out of some morbid wish for it to happen to me, but out of a desire to think about this life and what it's all about. Thinking about it delivers a strange sensation to me, to realize that the end of my life will be, for me, the equivalent of the end of all of existence itself. That the second after I pass and the moment of the heat death of the universe, if physicists are correct about that there'll be precisely the same amount of time for me, which it will be no time at all. Many, including trained philosophers, could consider these thoughts the uncultivated ponderings of a first-year college philosophy major. Perhaps, but in all my years of reading and attempting to deepen my capacity for philosophical reflection, these ponderings have never seemed to be any less relevant and provocative. It intensifies the inanity of so many of my own and others' worries about matters that seem to be so inconsequential in light of this inevitability that we all face. And it seems that one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century did not think it irrelevant either. Heidegger provides us a profound and highly influential consideration of death in light of his project for developing a phenomenological ontology that helps us consider the meaning of being in general. The profundity of his analyses are not due to a consideration of death as some inevitable fact of life, but instead in its consideration of how its possibility for us holds radical implications for us in this life, and indeed provides us with the broadest lens through which to understand our existence and even being itself. But he also recognizes that such a consideration is not without potential pitfalls. So we begin with Heidegger's attempt to establish the existentiality of death, starting with a consideration not of our own death, but the death of the other. And so in this video, the following questions will be addressed. 1. Why is death and not care the most primordial understanding of our being? 2. Is it even possible to understand being as a whole through its own death? And 3. Can the death of the other deliver us access to Dasein-as-a-whole? Beginning with section 45, we're now entering the second half of Being and Time, and Heidegger begins with the question of what has been gained so far and what we're still looking for. Most broadly, we've gained an understanding of care as the totality of those ontological structures that constitute Dasein and its being in the world. These insights have been gained by considering Dasein's concrete existence in its everydayness. Furthermore, it's through Dasein's entanglements in its inauthentic mode that we've been given a glimpse into Dasein's existence in its authentic mode, that is, its potentiality of being. However, what remains to be gained is the meaning of being in general. From what interpretive horizon can we gain this? Heidegger claims that the possibility of understanding being in general requires a primordial interpretation of Dasein. A primordial interpretation entails a kind of working out and appropriation of understanding. And understanding entails certain presuppositions such as the forestructure of forehaving, foresight, and foreconception. This forestructure in its entirety is what Heidegger here names the hermeneutical situation. And so to obtain the primordial interpretation, to reach being in general, requires a clarification of this hermeneutical situation of Dasein. And that very hermeneutical situation guides this clarification itself. Now, it's already been indicated that care is the most fundamental concept, encapsulating the totality of what has been gained from the existential analytic. So does care then offer the most primordial interpretation that allows us access to the meaning of being in general? Heidegger says no. And this is because the existential structures of which care constitutes their totality are first reached by considering the concrete existence of Dasein in its inauthentic mode of being. Although this was necessary for gaining initial access to the authentic mode of our potentiality of being, care has not offered a means for adequately interpreting this authentic mode and integrating it into the totality of our understanding of ourselves. Instead, the authentic mode has only been disclosed by what has been implied by the inauthentic mode. Let's consider that care, as disclosed in Dasein's everydayness, consists of what takes place between birth and death. This being of Dasein thus consists of not only what Dasein is, but also all that it can and will be. That is, its potentiality of being. So Dasein is always not yet being something. And as such, we have only comprehended Dasein as less than its whole. To consider Dasein as a whole, to integrate into our understanding its authentic mode of being, requires an analysis of what marks the limits or defines the totality of Dasein. In other words, the whole of Dasein includes all its possibilities. Still, those possibilities are not infinite, but are marked by limits. And that limit, like the outer edge of a circle, makes possible a consideration of the circle as a whole. That limit that defines the possible totality of Dasein is death. Being a whole is equivalent for Heidegger to being toward the end. This necessitates an existential concept of death that, along with an analysis of the conscience, will secure a primordial interpretation of the being of Dasein, which in turn will make possible a primordial interpretation of the meaning of being in general, as it will disclose the most primordial notion of all, which will be that of temporality. Whereas the being of Dasein is made visible in the mode of care, it's temporality that makes care itself intelligible. And it will be through temporality that the ontological structures of Dasein will be reinterpreted throughout the second half of this book. Section 46 presents us with the question as to whether it's even possible to consider Dasein as a whole. Heidegger raises one particular objection to the possibility. If care, as the essence of Dasein, is a being ahead of itself, then this entails that there always remains something outside of our grasp. There is a constantly unfinished quality that renders a consideration of Dasein as a whole problematic. Indeed, if there was no outside, no beyond, that would mean that Dasein is no longer there. In other words, if I'm defined by what I can be, and if I have reached the limit of my possibilities in this life only upon my death, then I can never have access to the totality of existence until I die. But when I die, I'm no longer available to access my existence. And so it could be concluded, as long as Dasein is, it's impossible to attain its wholeness. Heidegger doesn't directly take on this objection yet. Instead, he raises several questions about the argument. Whether it posits Dasein as objectively present, whether the argument itself grasps being ahead of itself existentially, and whether death itself is grasped existentially. And so the remainder of this chapter will seek to establish a positive response to the question about whether it is possible to discern Dasein as a whole. Section 47 begins to establish this possibility. Here, Heidegger suggests that if the wholeness of my death remains inaccessible, perhaps we can establish this possibility in the death of others to which we do have access. But Heidegger raises some problems with this suggestion. In the death of the other, we encounter the transition from the being of Dasein as life to the no longer Dasein, wherein we now encounter a corpse. Yet such a corpse remains a being in more than one way. First, it remains a possible object of study, such as when one donates their body to science and it becomes an object of biological and physiological study. But additionally, it also remains a being in another sense that goes beyond mere lifeless materiality. The corpse is also something that once was alive and has since been deceased. And Heidegger distinguishes the dead body from the deceased. With the deceased, we encounter a body that has been torn away from those who survive past the loss of that life. Furthermore, It's a body to be taken care of, besorgen, such as through funeral rites and graves. In this manner, the deceased remains a being with, though certainly in a modified form. In the death of the other, then, we have not experienced a genuine having come to an end. We don't experience the death of others in a genuine sense, but are, as he says, just nearby. Additionally, the other's death can never be equivalent to my death because substitution, that is, representing another in their place, though a constituted dimension of our being with one another, is not possible when it's a matter of coming to an end of Dasein. Now, of course, we can sacrifice our lives on behalf of another, but in that case, it becomes a matter of our own death. So we can die for another, but we can never die as another. Consequently, death has this peculiar characteristic of being a possibility that is always mine. But this returns us to the question asked in section 46. Seeing that death is ontologically constituted as being my own, and therefore being as a whole also only pertains to my existence, can we consider death as an existential phenomenon, or must we renounce the possibility of ever understanding it? By distinguishing biological death from the end of life of the other, and both from the end of Dasein, some ground has now been gained in addressing the question. Yet it's insufficient, and as such, we'll have to look elsewhere for our answer, which will be the next video's topic. I want to thank the following for supporting this channel on Patreon. If you wish to support this work on Patreon, the link is below in the description. You can also support this work by liking and sharing this video and subscribing to my channel. As always, thank you for watching, and until next time, be well.